Mark, thank you for joining me today. So you're CEO and founding director of CAST, and you're also government's champion for modern methods of construction for housing. Can you just tell me what those two roles entail?
So being CEO, as you would suspect, is about running a business really, and that keeps me pretty busy. So CAST is a 100 person consultancy. We're based here in London, in Farringdon, providing projects and cost management and strategic advisory to clients, a mixture of investors, developers, housing associations. We also do some policy related work for the likes of government departments, Homes England, regional authorities, etc. So yeah, it's very much about keeping that show on the road and leading the business. The government role as MMC champion for home building is about effectively being an ambassador for the role of MMC in modernising how we build homes. It's a role I've had now for 3 years, if I remember rightly, reporting to the Housing Minister. So there's been a few of them coming and going, including quite recently. But yeah, it's a real privilege to have been asked by government to help drive and evangelise really about the need for modern methods of construction in changing how we build homes, because we definitely need to do things differently. We can't carry on as we are.
So you're here today at FutureBuild as chair of AIM-CH, which is the Advanced Industrialised Methods for the Construction of Homes, which is a stakeholder group. Could you tell me the goals of the organisation? And understand there's been a 3-year innovation project. What are the outcomes of this innovation project, and how important is it actually for industry to listen to those outcomes and actually act on?
Yeah, sure. And well done for getting the acronym right. Yeah, so AIM-CH, Advanced Industrialised Methods of Constructing Homes, is all about back to this common theme of how do we change the method of how we build homes, how do we modernise the production method. So it was born out of the Transforming Construction Programme, which was a big government-funded initiative covering the whole of construction, announced back in 2018. £170 million worth of taxpayer money going into R&D projects to drive construction forward. AIM-CH was set up by quite a unique consortium actually, so it includes Barratt, one of the biggest house builders out there, L&Q, one of the biggest housing associations out there, Stuart Milne, who have got a big manufacturing plant as well as being a house builder in their own right, and Forster, who are actually an SME roofing contractor. So a really interesting range of different parts of the industry that have come together to say, well, how are we going to change how we build homes? You know, and that exam question is the recurring theme. So a need to build it with less labour, so we're being more productive, build it to a higher quality and more consistently, so we are not experiencing the issues that the industry unfortunately increasingly has about the quality of the output. We're building things safely, so clearly very important in the wake of Grenfell, and we're also reducing carbon. So one of the big themes of AIM-CH has been decarbonising the build, both in embodied carbon terms, but also the operational carbon of the end homes that we've been producing. And today, I was announcing some of the outputs of that study. So as you say, the end of 3 years of hard work and some really important outputs that have come out of that are going to be shared with industry so that other people can take them and use them and not have to go through the same learning curve. So whether it's how to create a digital manual for housing, for an SME, some of the digital tools for SMEs that we've used around augmented reality are going to be shared. The idea of how you create pattern books, how do you create more standardisation in how we design, and how you link pattern books to manufacturing is going to be shared with the supply chain. So some of these things are really important in terms of enabling businesses where perhaps the time and the money is not available for R&D, and they can leverage off what AIM-CH has done for the industry.
It seems that AIM-CH has a very genuine approach to collaboration and transparency. Do we need to see more of this across the industry? Because I always feel that there's lots of organisations that are still working in silos and not sharing that knowledge.
Yeah, we do, absolutely. It's human nature, I suppose, to an extent, to be a bit guarded. So particularly if you're investing your own company's money in R&D, then the natural tendency is, well, I want to keep this for my own competitive advantage. And there's nothing wrong with that in many ways, because actually the businesses involved in AIM-CH and many of the other R&D projects that have been showcased at FutureBuild are going to get first mover advantage because they've been involved, so they can go to market and trial these things and actually use that for the benefit of their own business. But ultimately, if we're really going to make the most of innovation in the industry, we do have to share, we do have to collaborate, we have to be less guarded. And my analogy that I often use is it's not about slicing the pie into smaller slices. It's actually about growing the size of the pie. And that's the thought process you have to think, because actually there's enough work for everyone, and we all just need to get a bit better at what we do, so we can make more money. Because ultimately, the financial imperative for R&D to be able to work more productively, to cut waste, to drive better quality and less rework, all of that means you can make more money. So it's a psychological thing about, well, why wouldn't you want to share that with the greater industry? Because it also helps the brand of the industry. So if we're reaching out to young kids and new talent who want to come into our industry, we want to see an industry at large that's doing things better. And that's how we can only do that through sharing.
You said that there's plenty of work, but it does feel like we're facing a perfect storm. So we've got increased legislation and regulations on one side, we're facing materials and labour scarcity, there's a tighter scrutiny around quality and competence. Are we asking too much from the industry?
It's a really good question, actually, and it's one that keeps me up at night sometimes in terms of the sort of world I work in. I think there's no two ways about it. We had this perfect storm, as you say, in terms of external factors that are now bearing down on the industry in a way we haven't seen before. So the labour crisis has been brewing for some time, and I've spoken about it at length for many years now, but it's now starting to come on the boil, and it's really worrying to see the stresses and strains that's placing on the industry in terms of the quantum of resource, but also the competency and the skills level of the resource we have. So it's not just about headcount. Have we got people with the right qualifications and the right competencies in the right roles? And it isn't just about bricklayers and carpenters on sites either. It's about surveyors and project managers and architects and engineers. So we have a broad issue about labour scarcity that is starting to really bite. But then, as you say, we have the regulatory reform, we have building safety, we have decarbonisation starting to come on the horizon now. And all of these things are going to act as a filter, a further filter for the available workforce that are capable of delivering the challenges we have. So we definitely have a sort of an urgency that's never been greater around responding to those external events and changing the way that we deliver in a way that makes our industry sustainable, not with a small s. We're going to have a future. We've got to think about models of working in terms of how we design, how we manufacture, how we build physically on site, that are a lot more resilient, that involve less people, if I'm to be frank, use more technology, use more standardisation and manufacturing principles, so we can address the issues of safety, carbon and labour scarcity by just reforming what we do.
I've personally been a long-term fan of off-site construction. The benefits of off-site construction in terms of speed, management of waste, better quality control, safer working conditions. We still seem to be in a position where off-site still hasn't reached sort of capacity and market uptake that it deserves. I think all too often we sort of see that clients, developers see the benefits of off-site, but when it comes down to the crunch point, human nature kicks in and we kind of go back to, we've always done it this way, and we sort of move back to traditional methods. How do we break that cycle?
Yeah, listen, it's a really interesting challenge, and you're absolutely right. I think there's definitely the mood music around MMC, modern methods of construction, off-site manufacturing, whatever you want to call it, has changed over the last few years. There's a lot more awareness, there's a lot more talking about it, but is there as much doing about it? I think that's a fair challenge. There's definitely an uptick in the adoption of different forms of MMC. Not all of it is volumetric modular, to use a particular reflection of MMC that people are probably most familiar with, which is sort of volumetric modules turning up on the back of lorries and being put together like Lego. There's very, very little of those projects in existence, and that's because the supply chain isn't that mature. What there is more of, and actually probably people are less aware of it, is that gradually the proportion of projects that is being manufactured is growing. It's slightly under radar, so actually you can't necessarily see it, but designers and contractors and specialists are making decisions on their own backs on projects to say, look, that particular piece of work, whether it's a cladding panel, whether it's a utility cupboard, whether it's a bathroom, more and more times now people are saying, we'll do that off-site. So actually MMC is happening under radar in a very subtle way, but we definitely do have to create more evidence and confidence in MMC. So one of the barriers to its growth is people are slightly not sure, they're slightly nervous about doing things differently. So the more that we can point to proof of where it works and where it works successfully, then I think people will just gradually turn towards it. It won't be a big bang, It will be an incremental journey of just shifting towards a different way of working, but it's got to be based on confidence, it's got to be based on people willing to fund it. So there's a financing issue, it's got to be insurable, and all of that's around evidence of how MMC performs, longevity, resiliency, etc. And all of those things I think we're gradually attacking bit by bit across the industry, but as I say, it's a long burn.
Back in 2016, you were commissioned by the Construction Leadership Council to look at a review of the UK construction model. The output was document Modernise or Die. We're now 6 years later. How relevant is that report?
From a personal perspective, maybe I would say this because I'm emotionally invested in it. It's more relevant than ever, as I see it. For the reasons I've already spoken about. We have a labour crisis that's amplified beyond what I predicted back in 2016. So I set out some of the challenges around demographic change, so a retiring workforce. I gave the first heads up around the danger of Brexit as being an attrition on our workforce, particularly here in London, where there's a high EU component. What I didn't foresee is the acceleration of COVID in terms of how that was going to impact on things in terms of putting real pressure on the availability of the workforce. It remains to be seen how much of that is a temporary as opposed to long-term change. But the labour crisis has only got worse. The labour intensity that our construction model relies on is becoming more and more difficult to sustain. Contractors are now unable to hold risk. They just can't do it. We have the added problems in geopolitical problems in the world at the moment around material availability and material inflation, which is adding to the problems we have. And so that resiliency that our industry has always been very good at has been declining over the last 6 years. And my clarion call, if you like, of Modernise or Die, I think is absolutely more relevant than ever. And I think without wanting to get ahead of myself, I get the sense that people understand that. They still struggle, I think, understanding what does that mean for me? How do I modernise rather than die? What does it mean for my business? How do I do something differently in a practical sense that I can do today? Is it all about off-site manufacture, which is not? There's a whole raft of different things that businesses can do to embrace change and modernisation, but I'm pretty certain that just doing things the same old way is not an option. Businesses are not going to survive, whether it's just the ability to attract resource, whether it's profit margins. We are under pressure in a way we haven't seen before. So I think everyone's being forced to think about doing things differently in their own little way.
So if we take that in terms of everyone being asked to think slightly differently, we're a future build, so it makes sense that we look to the future. So if you look at the changes that we're facing in terms of more scrutiny around competence, building safety bill coming in, are we at a point where we're facing a seismic change? The industry has always been told it's slow to change. Are we at a point in an era where actually seismic change is coming, and how is that going to manifest?
Yeah, I think it is. I think for the reasons I've already said, that there's always been a choice before for the industry to carry on doing things the way it's always done. I don't think that choice exists anymore. I think if you think about the labour issues that we have, that perhaps is a bit more insidious. That's sort of happening in the background. In London, there's probably the first examples of projects that are physically unable to procure labour now, which is a worrying sign. When some of the biggest projects can't get gangs of labour onto site to physically do stuff, you need to get worried about that, and there is evidence that's starting to happen. But for the larger part of the industry, it's probably a little bit more medium term. They don't see the urgency of it, but it's going to come up pretty rapidly. What I think is really going to focus people's minds is regulatory reform, where you don't have the choice because it's regulated, whether it's building regulations, whether it's statutory instruments for building safety and competence, the Building Safety Bill, for instance, whether it is the Future Home Standard. These things are going to get enshrined into law and will force designers and contractors and other associated parties to have to do things differently. So in many ways, what is now happening is tough love. We have a resurgence of regulatory governance, all for good reason, whether it's carbon, whether it's safety and quality. So the industry's got to get back with it in terms of how it's going to respond to those pressures. And as I say, it's going to drive change, seismic change, I think, in some respects, at a pace we haven't seen before.
One very last point, if there's one takeaway that you would like everyone to walk away from the show today thinking about, what would that be?
I think for me, it's actually reflected in everything you can see here at Future Build. So just having spent a bit of time this morning walking around, everyone's here with a solution. They're coming from a perspective of whether it's innovation in materials and products, whether it's services, whether it's new ways of doing things. Pretty much everything here is about some form of looking to the future, as you'd expect at Future Build. Wherever you work in the industry, just to come to a place like this and just take, maybe one thing away. Maybe it's an innovative material. Maybe it's a company that you think are doing things, selling a piece of technology that you think could work for your industry. So for me, there's not one thing. I think it's just the idea of having your mind opened, and Future Build is pretty unique in that regard in terms of the selection and choice of ideas that are being presented here, which I think is fantastic.
Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We hope you found this video from Fabric useful. For more, don't forget to subscribe, browse our playlists, and please like or share this video. Thanks for watching.